Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American culture in the 1980s. In the previous lecture, we began a discussion of musicians in the 80s and the importance of MTV in their careers. In this lecture, we continue that discussion of the importance of MTV for the generation in the 1980s. Another genre that struck a chord on the new music television was a second wave of the so-called British invasion. Some of the top artists in this genre were Duran Duran, Boy George and Culture Club, The Police, and Genesis. Duran Duran was a British new wave band from Birmingham, England. Featuring lead singer Simon Le Bon, Duran Duran became one of the most popular bands featured on MTV. They arrived in the United States in 1981 with a splash, as their racy Girls on Film video had to be heavily edited for U.S. television. It was 1982's Rio that launched the band to superstardom, with huge hits including the title track, Hungry Like the Wolf, and Save a Prayer, each accompanied by popular music videos. They invested more money, time, and effort in their videos than most bands, often teaming up with top directors and creating mini-movies. Their live shows were similarly innovative, employing huge screens, lasers, and visual effects to accompany the music. Selling more than 100 million albums and charting 21 top 100 hits, they were one of the best-selling bands of the decade. Arriving in the early 80s, Duran Duran led the charge in what has been called the Second British Invasion, after the wave of British bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones stormed America in the 1960s. They were, of course, followed by many other bands, including Boy George and Culture Club. Culture Club was headed by George Allen O'Dowd, known as Boy George, who employed an androgynous, heavily make-upped look inspired by David Bowie. Culture Club released several of the most identifiable hit songs of the 80s, including Karma Chameleon and Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? The Police were an edgier band, formed in London in 1977 and soon arriving in the United States. Led by lead singer and songwriter Sting, who went on to a prolific solo career. They released 5 #1 albums by 1983, when Synchronicity, their final studio album, became their masterpiece. Rolling Stone magazine described the Police in a 1983 article as, quote, the first British new wave act to break through in America on a grand scale, and possibly the biggest band in the world. Genesis was an English rock band formed in Surrey in 1967. Their early lineup included Peter Gabriel as lead singer. By the 1980s, Gabriel had moved on to a highly successful solo career, and the lead singing role for Genesis was assumed by drummer Phil Collins. Already rock veterans, Genesis finally broke through with mainstream success in the United States in the MTV age, with mega albums Abacab in 1981, Genesis in 1983, and Invisible Touch in 1986. Selling some 150 million albums worldwide, Genesis are one of the world's best-selling artists. Their 1986 video for Land of Confusion, featuring puppet versions of many of the iconic political and social figures of the day, offered a critical rendition of the Cold War standoff. It is one of the best remembered videos of the decade. The individual members of Genesis also went on to be some of the iconic performers of the 80s. Peter Gabriel, in particular, produced a string of hits and had one of the smash albums of the decade, So. The videos for Sledgehammer and Big were hugely popular, and the soulful In Your Eyes has become one of the best remembered songs of the decade, in part because of the famous scene in the movie Say Anything, in which a lovesick teen holds up a boombox playing the song to his would-be love. Also thriving in the 80s were the so-called hair bands, including Def Leppard, Bon Jovi, Poison, Skid Row, and many others. These bands tended to emphasize guitar riffs and trite themes in their music. Many of their songs focused on sex and women, life on the road, or drugs and alcohol, or all of the above. They also had a similar look: long hair, often teased to ridiculous heights, tights or spandex, and makeup to render an androgynous look. Despite the lack of depth in most of their songs, such bands were enormously popular, and in some cases the musicians demonstrated tremendous skill. Guitar players like Eddie Van Halen of Van Halen, or Slash of Guns N' Roses, singers like Freddie Mercury of Queen, Joe Elliott of Def Leppard, or Sebastian Bach of Skid Row, and drummers like Neil Peart of Rush or Peter Criss of Kiss were unquestionably skilled and talented musicians. On the whole, though, hair bands produced mostly trite and forgettable songs about quickly forgotten subjects. It was, in part, immense frustration with the emptiness of the hair band age that led to the rise of grunge by the end of the decade. In the late 1980s, bands like Guns N' Roses and Metallica, bearing resemblance to hair bands but with an angrier, harder edge, signaled that the musical scene was moving away from mindless hair bands. Grunge slammed the door for good. Originating in Seattle in the late 1980s, grunge was both a musical genre and a fashion statement. Drawing on many musical influences from the harder rock bands of the 60s, like The Who and the Rolling Stones, to 1970s supergroup Led Zeppelin, to punk rock and others, grunge music featured guitar distortion, angst-ridden lyrics, and deep, heartfelt, and often difficult to understand lyrics. Grunge musicians also stripped away all the big hair, makeup, and glitz common to the hair bands, preferring flannel or t-shirts and shorts or jeans. Beginning with Seattle bands like Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Pearl Jam, grunge soon swept across the nation, becoming a major fad in the early 90s. Finally, it was in the 1980s that hip-hop achieved mainstream success. As noted in a previous lecture, a pioneering group of rap artists began to break through in the late 1970s with popular songs. It took a collaboration with one of the biggest hair bands on the planet, though, for rap to achieve widespread popularity with white audiences. In 1986, Boston band Aerosmith seemed to be on the downside of their careers. After a string of monster hits in the 1970s, Aerosmith had slipped behind many other bands of the MTV generation. Racked by addiction issues, it had been years since their last big hit. At the same time, the rap trio Run DMC from Queens, New York, had risen to prominence in hip-hop circles, but hadn't broken through for mainstream success. Run DMC's manager, Rick Rubin, who knew his artists often sampled Aerosmith, and in particular the 1975 hit song Walk This Way, took a chance and called Aerosmith about a possible collaboration. The resulting song, and just as important, the music video, is one of the great collaborations of all time, and a huge milestone in modern rock history. The song was powerful and highlighted the rap prowess of Run DMC. The video, which featured the two bands battling in neighboring studios until Aerosmith lead singer Steven Tyler memorably broke down the wall between them, was entertaining and funny as well. Run DMC introduced rap music to the mainstream rock audience of white teens, and Aerosmith launched a revival that included a string of number one hits in the late 1980s and early 90s. Meantime, other hip-hop artists followed the success of Run DMC. A new generation of rappers, mostly from New York, experimented with new musical techniques such as sampling and spitting fast lyrics. Some, like the white rap group Beastie Boys, and a bit later the so-called Fresh Prince, Will Smith, employed humor. Artists such as LL Cool J and KRS-One deployed what one writer described as complex wordplay and lyrical kung fu. Collectively, the work of these artists in the late 80s and early 90s has come to be called the golden age of rap. Perhaps the most influential of all these artists was the group Public Enemy, spearheaded by lead rapper Chuck D and the eccentric performer Flavor Flav. PE elevated rap to new heights of social significance, with their emphasis on social issues such as police violence, poverty, and inequality. Chuck D's powerful voice lent additional credence to their message. Their masterwork was the 1989 LP, Fear of a Black Planet, featuring what has been called, quote, the most important song in hip-hop history, Fight the Power. The song, featured in the Spike Lee film Do the Right Thing, has become an anthem of the struggle for black equality and remains an instantly recognizable song even today. In our next lecture, we'll shift gears and talk about a different element of 1980s pop culture, the fascination with outer space.